So anyway, let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, now this evening we are going to be in 2 Kings 13 and 14. And in 2 Chronicles 25. I'm trying to keep these things sort of parallel as best I can so that we're, because Kings has certain elements in it that Chronicles only hits a little bit of it. And then conversely, sometimes Chronicles has more about a certain king and so forth than does Second Kings. So I'm trying to stay at fairly parallel with those, and so we don't get too far ahead in one book and then not in the other. So I'm just going to skip through those slides there because you've seen them so many times. You know where we're at, and here's the ever-present map. And so tonight there's a couple of places that we're going to be looking at that I'm going to be showing you. Of course, there's Jerusalem. We're going to have some action in Jerusalem and in Samaria up here. And then there's a photo of Hatzor here that we're going to be I'll be showing you, and right around down in here there's Beth Shemesh that we're going to be talking about, and then Lachish down here. And so those are the places that we'll be looking at tonight. All right, and here's our timeline. And so tonight we're going to be looking at it gets kind of confusing because we got Jehoahaz and Joash, and then we're going to stop actually on before we get to Jeroboam II. But over here we're just getting off of Joash in Judah, and Amaziah in Judah. And to make things even more confusing, when we see Joash here in Judah, well, you look over here and you have Jehoash in Israel. And actually, when you get to into 2 Kings and into Second Chronicles, they both refer to these people as Joash, and so they both had the same name. All right, and they overlapped. You had a King Joash in Judah and a King Joash in Israel, and they overlapped about 2 to 3 years. I can't figure it out exactly how many years it is, because when you start getting into these dates, there are a lot of differences in the dates depending on the particular scholars that you're looking at, and sometimes it's almost 100 years off, some of these guys with their dates as to when this stuff happened. So I try to find the consensus, the one that has the most people behind it that says it's on this date, and that's what I try to present, so that we don't have any real outliers there. 2 Kings 13, 1-3, verse, let's see, 13, 1-3. In the 23rd year of Joash, son of King Ahaziah of Judah, Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, became king over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. But he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes. He continued in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit, and he did not turn away from them. So the anger of Adonai was kindled against Israel, and he continually gave them into the hand of King Hazael of Aram, and that's Baghdad, that's Damascus, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael. Okay, so that's the Arameans, and basically what that was is the Syrians and up in Damascus. All right, so Jehoahaz, he became the king somewhere around 817, I think is what 814 BCE. And again, some of these dates, if you look them up, they may be a little bit different because of the way people count. And so we find that this guy was no different than any of the other kings of Israel. There was not one single king over Israel that did what was right in the sight of God. They all, from Jeroboam all the way down until the Assyrian invasion, every one of them did what was evil in God's sight. They worshipped, the false gods. They had a golden calf in Samaria, and then they had another golden calf up in Dan. I think I showed you pictures of that area up there where the temple was in Dan, which, it's amazing to me because you can still go up there, and that temple, the steps up to it and the floor of the temple, it's still there after almost 3,000 years. It's still there, and the foundation of where they had the altar is still there. And so it's quite incredible when you go up there and kind of look at it, and you get a feel for how they worshipped and what it looked like. So then as a result, as a consequence of not following God, God allowed the king of Aram, which of course is like I said, that's Damascus, King Hazael, to harass these guys. He oppressed them, kind of like the Philistines did back during the period of the Judges before David and Saul. Their oppression for this period in Israel's history came from the north and the east, which was Syria and Damascus. And so they just harassed them and oppressed them for many, many years, actually over a couple of generations that they did that. So, but God, the Bible says in there that God heard them, and He did send someone to redeem them or relieve them. Like during Judges, when they would get to a point and they'd cry out to God, and He would send someone to get the Philistines off of their back, and then they would be good for a while, and then they'd fall right back down into idolatry, and then they'd be oppressed by the Philistines. And they had that cycle. It went through the book of Judges. It went through 7 or 8 times. Well, this is kind of what is going on in Israel, the northern tribes. And so again, Pat and I were talking today about making sure that everyone knows that the difference that this split kingdom is. When you talk about Israel, a lot of times people want to just lump that all into all of the Jewish people, but it wasn't. That was the northern tribes of Israel. That was called Israel, and then the southern tribes was principally just Judah. It was some of Simeon and some of Benjamin, but it was principally just the tribe of Judah in the south, and they did surround all the area of Jerusalem, which was actually Benjamite. The Benjamites had that area right around Jerusalem, and then Simeon was down inside Judah, and they didn't have a lot of in fact, let me run back up there. You can look at this map here. This area right around Beersheba was principally Simeon. They didn't have any real territory. They just owned a few cities. And then this area around Jerusalem, this area here, was Benjamin. but then this entire area then became Judah under the divided kingdoms, and then all of the rest of this over here was all of the other 10 tribes up there. And so, all right, so that we'll get off that rabbi trail there and go into verse 6 and 7. Nevertheless, even though he had rescued them and kind of put Damascus at bay for a little while, said, nevertheless, they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit, but walked in them. And the Asherah pole remained standing in Samaria. Indeed, Jehoahaz was not left with a force of more than 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers, because the king of Aram had destroyed them and trampled them like dust when threshing. Well, I tell you what, if you look at the idea of only having 50 horsemen, that's their cavalry. They only had 50 of these, in their cavalry troop. That's nothing. And then 10 chariots. Well, that's really nothing either. And the 10,000 foot soldiers. Anytime that in the Bible it has a 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, whatever it is on the foot soldiers, be aware that there is a difference in the translation of some of these things, that when they said that it was 1,000, it could very well have been a military unit, like we would say that is a company of troops. And for us, a company would be something between 30 and 50 people, so the 10,000 foot soldiers may very well have been just 1,000. You move the decimal place over one, and it gets it into, in my mind, in my view, a little bit more manageable number. And there are people that translate this stuff, and they're on both sides of the issue, that they'll say, no, that's thousands, and others said, no, that's hundreds. And the Hebrew for that is not really clear. So anyway, they didn't have many people there in their army, and that they had, and I said the Asherah pole still remained, and there was just that shadow of an army. Really, it was just nothing more at all. Israel had nothing, and so they were open to the predations of anybody that wanted to come in and harass them, basically. And here are some Asherah poles that are still standing in Israel today. Here is one up in Hatzor. We saw when we were up there. It's and it doesn't stand very tall. It's only, if I remember, that thing is only about 3-4 feet tall or something like that. It's not very big, but these other ones are considerably larger. I've seen some of them that were 6-8 feet tall or better. But that's an Asherah pole. And they're made out of some of them, no, mostly they're just a cut stone. So they're not a concrete thing. So anyway, going on to skipping up to verse 10. In the 37th year of King Joash of Judah, Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, became king over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 16 years. But he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit, but he walked in them. Again, it's significant when they say, but he walked in them. That means that their whole lifestyle and everything that they did was in the idolatry and the false gods. It's like when we say, what is our halakha? That's what we walk in. We walk in the Torah. We walk in what God has for us to do. Well, they walked in what God didn't have them to do. And so they, similar name here, Jehoahaz, and they all, in some ways, they all just kind of run together in your mind if you don't sit down and try to figure it all out. They did, again, what was evil in God's eyes. Similar name, similar sin. It's all the same. And they were following Jeroboam again. That's just a different king, the same paragraph, that they still did what was wrong in God's eyes. Now, and then we go into the part where Elisha got sick from it with his illness, from which he would die. King Joash of Israel came down to him, wept over him, and cried, Avi, Avi, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Then Elisha said to him, okay, now, let me stop right there. That saying there, of course, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but I just wanted to hit it right now. Think about, when was the last time you heard that particular phrase? If anybody knows, just stick it in the chat there, and we'll go on. Avi, Avi, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Then Elisha said to him, take bows and arrows. So he took bows and arrows. Then he said to the king of Israel, mount your hand on the bow. Then he mounted his hand on it. Elisha then laid his hands on the king's hands. Now that's significant. All right. Elisha would have been in his 90s at this point. He had been in the ministry for about 65 years at this point. And so he was quite aged by this time, and he had actually kind of fallen out of the public view and so forth. And maybe, I don't know if you could actually say retired. I wrote retired there, but after the anointing of Jehu as king, then he just kind of settled back. But even at that point, he had sent a subordinate up there to do the anointing. And so possibly you look at Jehoash and Joash, it says both names. He went to see Elisha when he's on his deathbed, really. And then he comes to him and he says, Avi, Avi, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. All right, that was the same, nobody wrote it in chat, but that was the same expression that Elisha used when Elijah was being taken up in the whirlwind. Okay, he was surrounded by the chariots of fire, the horses and chariots of fire, and then he was taken up in a whirlwind. And he cried out, Avi, Avi, or Father, Father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. And so there are some commentators that look at this and say, well, Joash was trying to get Elisha to give him the anointing that he had gotten from Elijah by, saying the same thing that Elisha had said to Elijah. And if that was the case, Elisha didn't bite. Okay, and probably it was not his to give anyway, the anointing. And so he said he went ahead and proceeded to give Joash a prophecy, and he said, "Take bows and arrows, and take a bow and arrows." And so he took a bow and arrow, and he said, "Okay, open up the window." And that's in the next verses, but open the window and shoot. But before he did that, he put his hands on the hands of Joash. And it was almost as if then that some of the anointing of Elisha was then put into the hands of Joash, and gave him the ability, and we'll see a little bit later on, he did have some abilities then to defeat the Arameans, the people from Damascus. So he put his hands on the king's hands when he had his bow and ready to shoot. He said, going ahead with the next verse here, and all right. Open the windows to the east. And then Elisha said, shoot. And he shot. Then he said, Adonai's arrow of deliverance, yes, an arrow of victory over Aram. You will strike down the Arameans in Aphek until they are demolished. Then he said, take the arrows, and he took them. And then he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. And he struck it 3 times, then stopped. But the man of God was upset with him, and he said, if only you had struck 5 or 6 times, then you would have annihilated Aram till you had consumed it. But now you will strike Aram only 3 times. All right, now, so shooting the arrow, they shot the arrow basically in the direction of Syria and Damascus, the Arameans, the bulk of their territory. And so that was a sign that arrow, he said, the arrow of deliverance. And so that was a sign of God's victory over Aram. And then he said, strike the ground with the arrows. Now, in the translation into Hebrew, from Hebrew into the English, it reads that, yeah, kind of like strike the ground. But one linguist that studied this says it could be that he was saying, okay, shoot the arrows again, shoot at the ground, shoot out there as far as you can, and so that the arrow falls and sticks in the ground. And so he did that regardless of how it was. If he took the arrows and just poked them into the ground, or he actually shot them, it really doesn't matter, because he only did it 3 times. And I don't know how in the world this king Joash would have known. Yeah, keep on shooting until all of the arrows in his quiver were gone, or if it was just a deal where he didn't have the right kind of attitude, and he says, okay, yeah, let me do it 3 times. That's good. 3 is a good number. And so he shot him out there. And obviously Elisha thought that Joash should have known better, and that should have kept on shooting those arrows until he was all his chamber was empty, the quiver was empty, and he had no more arrows to shoot. And then that's how many victories he would have had over Aram, and been able to basically defeat them for good. But it didn't happen that way. So then it says, then Elisha died and they buried him. Now, this is a strange little story here. Now, bands of Moabite marauders used to invade the land at the spring of the year. That's when the Bible talks about, and kings went out to war. Well, they did that in the springtime, and it came about as they were burying a man. Behold, they saw a marauding band, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. As soon as the man's body touched Elisha's bones, he came back to life and stood on his feet. Now, that's pretty pretty powerful. That there was still so much anointing in Elisha that his bones brought somebody back to life. But it's also a metaphor for how that when things looked so bad for Israel and the marauders were coming, that they were dead men walking, that the power of God could resurrect them, and they would be victorious. But that's what that particular story says to me. Now, this here is they feel like that it could possibly have been the home of Elisha, and because they actually found an inscription on one of the walls, or somewhere in that had in there Elisha. And that was not a common name. I think there are only like 6 people in all the Bible that were named Elisha. And so some of the archaeologists and so forth look at that and say, now this could be his home. I tried to find a picture of where his tomb was, and there were too many variables in there, because I didn't want to show you. There was one that said that this was Elisha's tomb, as spoken by the prophet Muhammad, and it was up in Turkey. someplace. And I said, man, that's not it. So because he was buried right there in Israel, in the area of Ephraim. Okay, so then before we get into Amaziah, are there any comments or questions? Okay, I do have one more verse to read in 2 Kings 13, and then Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, restored from the hand of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the towns which he had taken out from the hand of his father Jehoahaz in war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the towns of Israel. So it's exactly like Elisha prophesied, that he would have 3 major victories, and they won back a bunch of the towns that the Arameans had taken over on the east side of the Jordan, and up on that northeastern side up there. There were several towns up there, and that he was able to recover. All right, now the story of Amaziah is told in the 2 chapters that we're going to be looking at, 2 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 25. Now, the only difference between those two is that 2 Chronicles offers a little bit more details concerning Judah's battle against Edom. Now, these accounts of Amaziah's reign describe actually 3 periods. First, we have the early days of his ascension to the throne. Second, we read of his battle with Edom, and third, the battle against Israel. Those are the 3 major sections of his life. And you'll see that Amaziah did some good things, but he was definitely, like a lot of people, he was imperfect, and he had an imperfect heart. So let's look at 2 Chronicles 25 and 1. Amaziah was 25 years old when he became king, reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoahaz from Jerusalem. Now he did what was right in the eyes of Adonai, but not wholeheartedly. He did it okay, but I mean, he didn't lead people off into idolatry, but he was just kind of, halfway, half-hearted. Yeshua talked about he said, I wish that you were going to be hot or cold, and since you're just lukewarm. So he was a lukewarm follower of God. So until the death of his father Joash, Amaziah, upon the death of his father, you remember Joash of Judah was then Amaziah was crowned the 8th king of Judah. His story is actually one of unnecessary failure. In fact, the reason was what I already mentioned. He did not serve Adonai with all of his heart. He did just a halfway job of it, and his loyalties were divided. And so he was aware of Torah. Now we'll see that in just a minute. He was totally aware. He knew what was right. He knew what he should be doing, but he just never did, really step up to the plate and was able to do what he should have been doing. So once he had the kingdom firmly secured under him, he executed his courtiers who had assassinated his father, the king. He did not put their children to death, but acted according to what is written in the Torah in the book of Moses, which Adonai commanded, saying, parents should not die for their children, neither should the children die for the parents, but every person should die for his own sin. Now, back in those days, when you had a new king come onto the throne, if the old king had been assassinated, then the new king would come to power, and all of the court officials that were involved in the assassination of the old king they would either try to run and hide, or they just knew that the jig was up and they were going to be killed. And so that was just the way that things were done back in those days. Not only that, but then they would also kill the all of the family members of the people that were involved in the assassination, and possibly even some of their business associates, or anyone who was a friend of theirs, or any kind of anything that would spark a revolution, or so that basically they're killing anybody and everybody that would be a threat to their new throne. So Amaziah says that he knew what acted according to the Torah, which said parents should not die for the children, neither should the children die for the parents, but every person should die for his own sin. Now, another rabbi trail here. Let me get onto that because I didn't have it in my notes. But the thought occurred to me that, there are people that say the Torah was actually written during the Babylonian exile, that all of that stuff was written, and it was much after the fact, and they just attributed it to Moses, and then further on down to Samuel, and whoever wrote Judges, and then Kings and Chronicles. And so this little sentence right there, though, pretty much tells you that no, Torah had already been written, because they quoted it here in Second Chronicles. In the part, during the divided kingdom, there was Torah, and they mentioned there was Torah, and that they knew what Torah was. So had it been written, 500 years later, well, it'd be 300 years later, 300 or 400 years later, during the Babylonian exile, then they would not have known that. It would not have been written down to where they could say, yeah, that's what the Torah says. So there again, that's just a little side trip that I just happened to think of right then. Amaziah was 25 years old when he became the king, and about 50 years earlier, you remember that Judah had reached one of the lowest points in her history. Right after the death of Ahaziah, his mother Athaliah, you remember, she seized control of the throne and attempted to kill all the rightful heirs. Remember, she's wiping out the competition. And it was basically her grandsons. She was killing her own grandsons so that they would not be a threat to her power. And fortunately, her attempt to destroy the true heirs was unsuccessful. We talked about that last week. And so that the lineage of David all the way down to the Messiah, Yeshua, was not wiped out. There was always a remnant, always one. Sometimes it hung by a thread, just one guy, but Joash was hidden away by Ahaziah's half-sister and was proclaimed king when he was 7 years old. You remember from last week. Under the influence of the high priest, then Joash restored the temple and the practices of the law. Now, but when the high priest died, the temple was abandoned, the practice of the law, and so the people returned to the worship of idols. And so in the last days of his reign, he suffered a humiliating defeat against the Syrian army. And so that was the condition of Judah when Amaziah became king. He took the throne when his father was assassinated because of his failures against the Syrian army, and people just felt like that he had also taken all the gold and silver out of the temple and other places and given it to King Hazael of Aram, or Damascus, to as a bribe or as a tribute, so that he would leave him alone. Well, guess what? He went away, and then the next year he came back and sacked Jerusalem. So for that practice, for that thing, then everybody went, and his people at court then assassinated him. So in punishing the men who killed his father, Amaziah demonstrated his potential of becoming or being a good leader, as well as also his knowledge of the law. He didn't seek vengeance on entire families, but he only punished those that were directly involved in the murder of his father, and he did it as it was written in the law of the kings of Judah. So he was the king, though, that served God only halfway. So, all right. So going ahead, comments or questions? All right, now he did what was right in the eyes of Adonai, yet not like his father David. He did like his father Joash had done. Still, the high places were not taken away. The people were still sacrificing and burning incense in the high places. Now, it talks about David, his father. Well, we know David was not his father, but his great, 8 generations back, his grandfather, great grandfather. And so but in Hebrew, there's not a word. In the ancient Hebrew, there was not a word for grandfather or great grandfather or great great grandfather. It was just the father of. And so, meaning that, okay, he was in the lineage there. All right. So, he served Adonai, but not with that same zeal that David had. Because God talked about David being the a man after his own after God's own heart, and he left all these high places intact. He didn't try to, he took the politically expedient way around it and just left everything as it was, and he didn't try to stop the people from going and burning incense and offering sacrifices. And remember, the Bible said, God says, you're not to offer sacrifices anywhere except where I put my name, and that was Jerusalem. So he didn't even try to stop that stuff. So he gathered together. Okay, now here's a story about going against the Edomites, and he gathered together the people of Judah and assigned them according to their clans to officers of thousands and officers of hundreds for all of Judah and Benjamin. He mustered those from 20 years old and upward and found 300,000 chosen men. Able to go to war, able to handle spear and shield. He also hired 100,000 valiant warriors from Israel for 100 talents of silver. All right, so here he is. He gathered an army of 300,000, and again, remember, okay, it could have been 300,000. It could have been 30,000, depending on how that word in Hebrew is. But for argument's sake, let's just go ahead with 300,000. That's fine. And he hired 100,000 mercenaries from Israel. These were principally from the tribe of Ephraim. All right, and but what happened is a man of God came to him and said, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for Adonai is not with Israel, not with any of the children of Ephraim. For if you go and fight courageously in battle, God will overthrow you before the enemy, for God has power to help and to bring down. But Amaziah said to the man of God, and what is to be done about the 100 talents that I gave, that I have given to the Israelite troops? The man of God said, Adonai is able to give you much more than that. So Amaziah dismissed the troops who had come to him from Ephraim to go back to their homes. Their anger burned greatly against Judah, and they returned home in a rage. We'll see what they do in a little bit. So this prophet, he warned Amaziah against using Israel, and to his credit, Amaziah listened to the prophet. A lot of these guys wouldn't listen to the prophets, and so they he sent them home, and said they were not happy with him. They were very disgruntled, because when you got a chance to go to war, that was a chance to pillage and just increase your own wealth dramatically if you were successful, that you could carry off all the spoils of war. And so they were spoiling for a fight. They were mercenaries. That's what they did for a living. They fought. And so they did not want to go back home. Now there, before we get to this, I'm going to go ahead and read the another part of it. Here's Amaziah took courage, leading his army, marched to the valley of Salt. He struck down 10,000 men of Seir, that's down in the Edomite country, and the army of Judah also captured 10,000 alive. And they brought them to the top of the cliff. They threw them down from the top of the cliff, and everyone fell to their death. That's kind of mean and brutal, but they did it. Meanwhile, the troops that Amaziah had sent back and not allowed to go with him to battle raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Ben-Horon. They struck down 3,000 of them and took considerable spoil. So these mercenaries from Israel then attacked Judah and just took a lot of money. It says considerable spoil, and they killed 3,000 people from Judah, Judeans. So keep that in mind. After punishing the murders of his father Amaziah, he began building this army. He had 300,000 and another 100,000, but now they sent back the troops, and then they really turned on him, and so that's because he listened to God. God gave him a mighty victory, and so that's where we left it. Then we going on to, there's another part of it though here. Let me get, I think I missed that. Okay. Yeah. After Amaziah returned from slaughtering the Edomites, he had the gods of the men of Seir brought and installed as his gods. He prostrated himself before them and burned incense to them. The anger of Adonai burned against Amaziah, and he sent a prophet to him, and who said to him, "Why have you sought after the gods of the people who could not deliver their own people from your hand?" But while he was still speaking to him, the king said to him, "Have we appointed you a counselor to the king? Stop. Why should you be struck down?" Meaning, in other words, why should I not kill you now? So the prophet stopped after he said, "Now I know that God has determined to destroy you, because you have acted this way and have not listened to my counsel." So that's where Amaziah, he let his arrogance get the best of him, and he brought these gods back. I mean, just all you can say is, "Man, what were you thinking?" And he began to worship these little g gods that had absolutely no power or anything, of course. And so when the prophet questioned him, he lashed out at the prophet, and so the prophet said, "Okay, fine, but now God is going to destroy you for that." And he went his way. And so then we see that Amaziah really, he loses it, because, okay, he was somewhat justified by going to the king of Israel and saying, "Look, let's meet on the field of battle." It says, let me read it to you. It says, "Amaziah, king of Judah, took counsel and sent this message to Joash, son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, king of Israel, saying, 'Come, let us meet face to face.'" That meant, let's go to battle. Joash, king of Israel, replied to Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, "The thorn bush in Lebanon sent a message to the cedar in Lebanon, saying, 'Give your daughter to my son in marriage.' Then a wild beast of Lebanon passed by and trampled the thorn bush. You say, 'Behold, I have defeated Edom,' so now your heart has become arrogant and proud. Stay home. Why ask for trouble and cause your own downfall and that of Judah with you?" However, Amaziah would not listen, for it was from God, in order that he might deliver them into the hand of Joash, because they had sought the gods of Edom. So King Joash of Israel attacked. He and King Amaziah of Judah confronted one another at Beth Shemesh, which belonged to Judah. Then Judah was routed before Israel, and every man fled to his tent. meaning that they scattered. All the soldiers scattered. So King Joash of Israel captured King Amaziah of Judah, son of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, in Beth Shemesh. Then Joash brought him to Jerusalem and broke down the wall of Jerusalem from Ephraim gate to the corner gate, 400 cubits. He took all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of God with Obed-Edom, and together with the treasuries of the king's palace and the hostages, and returned to Samaria. Amaziah, the son of King Joash of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. Now the rest of the acts of Amaziah, the first and the last, behold, are they not written in the book of kings of Judah and Israel? From that time that Amaziah turned away from following Adonai, they conspired against him in Jerusalem. So he fled to Lachish, but they sent men after him to Lachish and put him to death there. Then they brought him back on horses and buried him with his fathers in Judah. All right, so we see that Amaziah, in some ways he was justified because the men of Ephraim had destroyed 3,000 of his own people and cities and so forth. So he, in some ways, maybe he was a little justified with going against Israel. But by this time, Israel had pretty much bulked up, and they were well able to defend themselves. And in fact, God turned Judah over to Israel, and Judah was defeated. All of their people scattered, and they captured Amaziah. And so they took him back to Jerusalem. Now that's the ultimate insult right there. They captured the king and then brought him back to his own capital. And basically they just took all of the gold and silver, everything out of the temple, which kind of tells you what Israel thought of the temple of God at that point. That they had just completely, they were completely apostate at that point, and held nothing in the temple as sacred. And then they went into the palace and took all of the goody stuff out of the palace, any gold and silver, which I don't know how much was left after Amaziah's father had given it away to the king of Damascus there, the Aramean king. But they went in and they destroyed 600 feet of the wall of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem wasn't even defensible at that point then. And so they fought this battle at Beth Shemesh. Here's Beth Shemesh here. Here's Jerusalem. Here's a picture of Beth Shemesh. And in fact, we have been there. We participated in an archaeological dig there, and that was kind of cool. And so, but that's where they defeated them there. Went back to Jerusalem, and then we see that I've already read this part, that where he turned away from the following Adonai. They conspired against him in Jerusalem, and so he fled. It's a little bit dodgy as to the timeline on that, because it said that he lived another 15 years after the king of Israel had died, and so they this must have been kind of an uneasy alliance, or an uneasy time there, where Amaziah was still in charge, maybe, sort of, kind of, but it finally got to the point where they'd had enough. They were going to go after him, so he went to Lachish. Now here is the picture of Lachish. This is the tell, just and if you'll look at, here's an artist representation of it, and the double wall, inner wall, outer wall, and you can see here's the gate here. Well, you can see the gate. This is the gate ramp and road into Lachish right here. Okay, so what you're seeing on here is this part right here, and then up here would have been the palace area that he had there in Lachish. All right, and so they went ahead and killed him, and then brought him back to Jerusalem, and they said he was buried with his fathers in the city of Judah.